Welcome. This chapter covers the final years of the Kingdom of Judah from 608 to 586 before the Common Era, a period defined by foreign intervention, prophetic warning, and ultimate collapse. After the death of Josiah, Judah's political situation grew precarious. His son Jehoahaz ruled briefly, followed by Jehoiakim, during whose reign Egyptian influence and idolatry increased. Prophets, including Uriah the son of Shemaiah and Jeremiah, renewed their warnings, urging adherence to the covenant. The fall of Assyria shifted regional power, allowing Nebuchadnezzar to assert dominance. Jehoiakim initially submitted to Babylonian authority but later rebelled, leading to his death. His son Jehoiachin reigned briefly before being deposed, and Zedekiah became the last ruler of Judah. Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem, temporarily lifted due to Egyptian intervention, but ultimately prevailed after defeating Egypt. The city was captured, Zedekiah was taken to Babylon, and Judah's capital and temple were destroyed, marking the definitive end of the kingdom. The prophet Jeremiah mourned these events, preserving the grief and lamentations of the people for posterity. The death of King Josiah left Judah in a state of profound uncertainty and vulnerability. Josiah had hoped to secure the independence of his kingdom by halting Egyptian interference in the affairs of neighboring nations, yet this policy ultimately subjected his own people to foreign domination. In Jerusalem, where the king's passing was bitterly mourned, the nation took no immediate action until a new ruler was chosen. Josiah had three sons, the eldest, Eliakim, the second, Shallum, and the youngest, Mattaniah. Josiah appears to have selected Shallum, the son of his favored wife, as his successor. In honor of their late king, the people ratified this decision, despite Shallum being 2 years younger than Eliakim. Upon ascending the throne, Shallum adopted the name Jehoahaz, as was customary for kings to assume a renowned name distinct from their birth name. The reality of Judah's political situation, however, rendered the people's choice almost irrelevant. The decisive authority rested not with the nation or with the sacred anointing oil, but with the king of Egypt, to whom Judah had become subject following the Egyptian victory at the Battle of Megiddo. Pharaoh Necho, having advanced to the Euphrates by forced marches and seized territories in Aram, or Syria, formerly under Assyrian control, had established his residence at Riblah. Jehoahaz traveled there to obtain confirmation of his election and to receive Judah as a tributary province. Yet Pharaoh Necho, unswayed by the nation's wishes, took Jehoahaz into chains and transported him to Egypt, where he would remain in captivity. In his place, Necho appointed Eliakim as king, who then assumed the name Jehoiakim. Jehoahaz's reign lasted but 3 months. The new king, Jehoiakim, faced an immediate and humiliating burden. Pharaoh Necho imposed upon Judah a tribute of 100 kikars of silver and 1 kikar of gold, punitive measures for Josiah's obstruction of his military campaign. With the palace and temple treasures depleted, Jehoiakim resorted to levying taxes on the wealthy, forcing them to supply the demanded sums under duress. This imposition compounded the nation's humiliation, as the hope inspired by Josiah's reforms had now faded. The people, disillusioned and dispirited, perceived their God as powerless, having allowed the death of a righteous king on the battlefield and the subjugation of the land to foreign rule. A relapse into idolatry quickly followed. The nation, seeking security or favor through imitation of foreign practices, erected altars in high places on every hill and beneath every green tree. In Judah, there were as many gods as there were settlements. Special veneration was offered to the Egyptian goddess Neith, the queen of heaven, whose worship had been most prominent in Sais, the capital of Pharaoh Necho. The people attributed his military success to this deity and sought her favor through their own devotion. Images of gold, silver, wood, and stone were restored in private homes, and the temple itself was desecrated once more by grotesque idols, echoing the religious corruptions of the reigns of King Manasseh and King Az. Most horrifying of all, the abominable practice of child sacrifice was revived. In the lush and once sacred valley of Hinnom, altars were erected to Moloch, and infants, particularly firstborn children, were ruthlessly offered as burnt offerings. These abominations were accompanied by moral decay across society, adultery, sexual immorality, oppression of strangers, widows, and orphans, corruption in the courts of justice, dishonesty, exploitation of the poor through usury, and violent crime were all rampant. A remnant of the population remained faithful to the law, grieving the moral collapse, yet their influence was insufficient to effect meaningful reform. False prophets arose, justifying wrongdoing and promoting vice, and even the king, Jehoiakim, though not a promoter of idolatry, either through weakness or tacit sympathy, refrained from enforcing moral order. The stern warnings of the genuine prophets, voices calling the nation back to justice and faith, were disregarded. Those who delivered them were persecuted, silenced, or slain. Judah, once the beacon of devotion and law under Josiah, was now enveloped in moral confusion, idolatrous fervor, and political subjugation, setting the stage for the final calamities that would befall the kingdom. The prophets of God faced a formidable and dangerous task in these dark days of moral and religious decay. They knew persecution and harsh treatment awaited them, yet they were driven by an unshakable sense of duty to oppose fearlessly the impending ruin of their nation. In the last 2 decades before the destruction of the Jewish kingdom, no period saw so many prophets arise. They spoke almost daily, addressing the people, the princes, and the king at every opportunity. They warned, exhorted, and threatened, prophesying doom should the prevailing wickedness persist. Among those whose names have survived are Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, Uriah, the son of Shemaiah, Habakkuk, and Ezekiel. Many others, named by history, fought equally valiantly against idolatry and corruption, though their words were not preserved. Uriah, son of Shemaiah, hailed from Kirjath-jearim, a town known as the Forest City. Very little is known of him except for the tragic circumstances of his death. At the beginning of the reign of King Jehoiakim, between 607 and 604 before the Common Era, Uriah boldly prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and the entire land unless the people abandoned their evil ways. When King Jehoiakim learned of these prophecies, he sent messengers to seize and execute Uriah. Warned of his peril, Uriah fled secretly to Egypt, yet the king's fury was relentless. Jehoiakim dispatched a noble to Egypt to demand the prophet's surrender. Uriah was brought back to Jerusalem, beheaded, and his body thrown among the burial places of the common people. This murder, intended to intimidate, only strengthened Jeremiah, inspiring him to pursue his prophetic mission with renewed resolve. With the accession of King Jehoiakim and the nation's return to sin, Jeremiah resumed his work, which had been interrupted during the reign of Josiah. He now fully comprehended the meaning of the words spoken to him at the onset of his calling. I have made thee a fortified city, and an iron pillar, and brazen walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, against the princes thereof, against the priests thereof, and against the people of the land. He was to stand firm, unmoved, and meet persecution with courage. Jeremiah, grown to manhood, took no wife, abandoning household joys, for the shadow of coming calamities weighed heavily upon him. He went forth alone, burdened with the sins of his nation, incapable of participating in ordinary pleasures while Jerusalem faced imminent doom. Early in Jehoiakim's reign, Jeremiah's warnings drew the enmity of the zealous idolaters, especially the priests and false prophets. During a festival, as the people gathered to offer sacrifices, Jeremiah proclaimed, Thus saith the Lord God of hosts, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Is this house, which is called by my name, to be a den of robbers? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. And now, because ye have done all these works, saith the Lord, and I spake unto you, rising up early and speaking, but ye heard not, and I called you and ye answered not. Therefore will I do unto this house, which is called by my name, wherein ye trust, and unto the place which I gave to you and your fathers, as I have done unto Shiloh. The priests and false prophets seized him, declaring that he deserved death for predicting the ruin of the temple. A tumult erupted in the courts of the temple, with some bystanders supporting Jeremiah. The disturbance prompted princes to leave the palace for the temple, among them Ahikam, son of Shaphan, who, with others aligned with the prophet's party, convened a court of justice at one of the temple gates. After hearing the accusations and the defense, the princes decreed that Jeremiah did not deserve death, affirming that he spoke in the name of God. Through their intervention, he was temporarily spared, though the hatred of the priests and false prophets burned ever more fiercely. Meanwhile, the doom of the Assyrian Empire was fulfilled. Nineveh, the great and mighty city, fell after a prolonged siege in 605 before the Common Era, brought low by the combined forces of Cyaxares of Media and Nabopolassar of Babylon. The last Assyrian king, Sardanapalus, perished in his own citadel by fire. The collapse of Assyria reshaped the political landscape. Media, under Cyaxares, claimed the largest portion of Assyrian territory, while Nabopolassar received Babylonia, Elamites, and the western districts of the Euphrates. Nabopolassar did not reign long after his triumph. He was succeeded by his son, Nebuchadnezzar. who ruled from 604 to 561 before the Common Era. Nebuchadnezzar was both a formidable warrior and a wise, far-sighted statesman. Though firm in punishing enemies, he tempered his severity with prudence. He strengthened his kingdom internally, built enormous structures, and established a system of navigation through canals. With these preparations complete, Nebuchadnezzar embarked on a broader campaign of conquest. The Aramean districts of Syria, once part of Assyria but now divided into smaller territories, were subdued with minimal resistance. Subsequently, the Phoenician cities fell under his dominion, and their king, Ethbal, also known as Ethbal II, became a vassal to Nebuchadnezzar, compelled to pay tribute and recognize his supremacy. The mighty conqueror, Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Chaldeans, confronted Jehoiakim, king of Judah, with an ultimatum: either swear allegiance and submit to his rule, or face complete destruction. At the same time, the Pharaoh of Egypt counseled Jehoiakim to resist the Chaldean monarch and promised to send military support. Judah found itself in a position very similar to that of the reign of Hezekiah, its capital once again a potential battlefield between two great empires. The king and his counselors hesitated, weighing the promised aid from Egypt against the overwhelming might of the Chaldeans, and delayed a decisive policy day by day, hoping for some miraculous intervention. Amid this growing fear, a fast was proclaimed in the 9th month of the winter of 600 before the Common Era. The entire nation was summoned to Jerusalem, and thousands of men, women, and children crowded into the temple courts, entreating the Lord to avert the impending calamity. At this time, the prophet Jeremiah, known as Jeremiah, commanded his faithful disciple Baruch to write down a prophetic exhortation which Jeremiah had delivered years before. In it, he had foreseen that Judah, along with the surrounding nations, would fall under the dominion of the rising Chaldean Empire. Once inscribed upon a scroll, Baruch was instructed to read it aloud in the temple before all the inhabitants of the city and countryside, representing the prophet, who for some reason could not be present. Though hesitant at first, Baruch obeyed. In the upper court of the temple, he read each word to the assembled people, and the message struck a chord of alarm and dread. A young man, Micaiah, son of Gemariah, hastened to the princes of Judah, who had gathered in one of the halls of the royal palace, and reported the reading. Terrified, the princes demanded that Baruch repeat the reading before them. Every word weighed heavily upon their hearts, and their fear was palpable. They determined to inform King Jehoiakim, hoping that the warning would compel him to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar and avert disaster. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Jehoiakim commanded that the scroll be brought before him, but as Baruch read, the king, in open defiance, took each leaf and threw it into the fire. He continued until the entire scroll was consumed before the eyes of the princes, who watched in dismay and begged him to consider the consequences. Jehoiakim paid no heed. Following this act of rebellion, he issued orders to capture and kill both the prophet Jeremiah and his disciple Baruch, just as Uriah, another faithful servant of God, had been executed. Fortunately, the princes who had previously aided Jeremiah had hidden both men, sparing them from death. This day left Jerusalem in intense excitement and anxiety. Though the fast had brought no immediate relief, the reading of the scroll divided the council of princes. Some, convinced by the prophet's words, resolved to submit to Nebuchadnezzar. Among them was Elishama, the keeper of the lists, responsible for the organization of the kingdom's armies. Their opposition to war forced Jehoiakim into a temporary submission. He paid tribute to Nebuchadnezzar, promised military support, and undertook all the duties required of a vassal, inaugurating the Chaldean suzerainty over Judah in 600 before the Common Era. Jeremiah was now able to leave his hiding place, but the princes who had protected him maintained their watch over his life despite the king's anger. Jehoiakim bore the Chaldean yoke reluctantly, yet the king of Egypt continued to encourage him to resist. When Ethbal II of Phoenicia withdrew his allegiance in 598 before the Common Era, Jehoiakim foolishly followed suit. He refused to pay tribute and aligned himself with Egypt and likely with Phoenicia. In response, Nebuchadnezzar had to divert forces to lay siege to Tyre, which lasted 13 years, preventing him from immediately punishing Judah. Jehoiakim may have believed he had secured his independence, yet the country still suffered from predatory raids by Idumean, Moabitish, and Ammonitish bands, leaving towns ravaged and lands plundered. At this critical moment, Jehoiakim died in 597 before the Common Era. His young son, Jehoiachin, known also as Jeconiah or Coniah, ascended to the throne under the regency of his mother, Nasha. The young king, like his father, continued in rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar and in the idolatry and immorality that had plagued Judah. He relied upon the protection of Jerusalem's strong walls and hoped for support from Egypt, believing himself safe from the Chaldean army. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar, having concluded operations at Tyre, was free to redirect his forces southward against Egypt. His army easily subdued all land south of Phoenicia, including the entirety of Judah, save for a few fortified southern towns. Many who fell into Chaldean hands were made prisoners, yet Jehoiachin persisted in opposition, confident that his city and Egyptian allies would secure his position. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, therefore dispatched some of his generals with a formidable army to lay siege to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. King Jehoiachin, who had sat on the throne of David for scarcely 100 days, had no time to contemplate repentance or prepare his people, for the Babylonian besiegers pressed relentlessly upon the city. The distress among the inhabitants grew unbearable, and recognizing the futility of resistance, Jehoiachin began to negotiate terms of surrender with the generals. When Nebuchadnezzar himself arrived at the encampment, he was entreated by the king, the queen mother, and her court to show mercy. The Babylonian conqueror, however, displayed neither leniency nor pity. He imposed severe conditions. Jehoiachin was to relinquish his throne and go into exile, accompanied by his mother, his wives, his kin, and the eunuchs who served in the palace. Remarkably, Nebuchadnezzar spared the life of the young king, refraining entirely from bloodshed. Yet the consequences for the people were severe. 10,000 warriors and inhabitants of Jerusalem, drawn indiscriminately from the various families of the capital, were uprooted and transported to Babylonia. Among these captives were 1,000 skilled mechanics, artisans trained in forging weapons and building fortifications, whose talents were valuable to the Babylonian war effort. Additionally, 3,023 Judeans from the surrounding countryside were taken as prisoners to Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar also seized the treasures of the palace and the temple, a measure justified by the military laws of the era. Yet he left the city itself intact, sparing its walls and leaving the temple uninjured. For a conqueror, the moderation shown by Nebuchadnezzar was extraordinary. Jerusalem, a city with over 500 years of history, had never before witnessed such measured treatment. The Babylonian king likewise refrained from abolishing the throne of David. Instead, he placed on it the youngest son of King Josiah, Mattaniah, who assumed the royal name Zedekiah. Zedekiah was of a gentle, unwarlike, and pliable disposition. Nebuchadnezzar believed that these qualities would ensure peace and submission in Judah. To secure the new king's loyalty, the Babylonian ruler concluded a solemn treaty with Zedekiah, binding him with an oath of fealty. The land of Judah held extreme strategic importance to Nebuchadnezzar as a buffer against Egypt, a power he was continually seeking to subdue. To prevent rebellion, he had exiled the noble families and princes of Judah, removing daring and ambitious men who might persuade the king to act against Babylonian interests. His objective was clear: to render Judah a weak, dependent state, deriving its strength from Babylon. Despite the severe blow of losing so many noble families and the finest warriors of the nation, Judah's remnant recovered with astonishing rapidity. The capital and countryside, though filled with sorrow and subjugation, rebuilt themselves and returned to a measure of prosperity. Yet the nobles of Judah were dissatisfied with their modest condition. They sought broader spheres of influence. For the previous century, the capital's nobles had not only governed the people but had also dominated the royal court. The kings themselves were often of little consequence, living lives of leisure in imitation of rulers such as Sardanapalus, the ancient Assyrian monarch, preoccupied with trifles within the harem of the palace. Now, with Zedekiah's unkingly weakness and indolence, these nobles could assert themselves more easily. The king, though personally well disposed, lamented the nation's evils and listened to the prophets, yet he lacked the strength to oppose the nobles and restrain their ambitions. Zedekiah may have intended to remain faithful to his oath to Nebuchadnezzar, but he did not possess the fortitude to enforce his resolution. Secretly, rebellious schemes were formed, which he either did not perceive or, if aware, was powerless to prevent. This combination of the king's weakness and the nobles' recklessness ultimately set Judah on the path to catastrophe. Madness seemed to seize the nobles. Suggestions for rebellion spread across the land. Egypt, ever deceitful and treacherous, tempted the Judeans with promises of alliance which it rarely fulfilled. King Ethbal of Tyre, a powerful Phoenician ruler, urged Judah and neighboring territories to rise against Babylon. Meanwhile, The exiled Judeans, still in communication with their homeland by letters and messengers, clamored for war, holding on to a vague hope that Nebuchadnezzar's army could be defeated and that they might regain freedom. In the fourth year of Zedekiah's reign, corresponding to the year 593 before the Common Era, ambassadors from these various nations arrived in Jerusalem. They came from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon, employing every device of eloquence, flattery, and persuasion to sway the wavering monarch into breaking his oath. Judah, courted by foreign powers and at the center of geopolitical schemes, might have felt a sense of pride in being sought after for alliance. It is unknown what reply Zedekiah sent to these ambassadors. His weakness of character made a decisive answer all but impossible, and to this maelstrom of political pressure, the prophet Jeremiah stepped with courage that few could match. His prophetic insight perceived the inevitability of Nebuchadnezzar's sweeping victories and the subjugation of many nations under Babylonian authority. Jeremiah warned King Zedekiah, the nation, and the priests not to succumb to flattering promises or vain hopes, but to submit to Babylonian rule, lest they be crushed by the overwhelming power of the conqueror. Jeremiah's prophetic mission extended even to the exiles in Babylon. He sent them a message, instructing them with extraordinary clarity: build houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them, take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, and multiply you there and be not diminished. The prophet Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, had long counseled the exiles in Babylon to seek the welfare of the city to which they had been carried captive. He urged them to pray to the Lord for its peace, declaring that in the prosperity of Babylon they would find their own peace. Jeremiah warned them to disregard the false prophets among them, as well as the dreams that were reported to come from men claiming divine inspiration, for the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, had not sent them. He proclaimed that after 70 years, the appointed time for Babylon would be completed, and the Lord would fulfill his promise by returning his people to their land, restoring them to the place of their ancestors. Yet King Zedekiah, son of Josiah, could not long resist the seduction of these false prophets, nor the pressures that arose from external powers, notably Egypt and the neighboring nations, and from the ambitions of Judah's own nobles. Influenced by these forces, Zedekiah renounced his oath of allegiance to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in the year 591 before the Common Era. He refused to pay the tribute imposed by Babylon, casting Judah onto a path of rebellion that would seal the fate of the nation. Nebuchadnezzar, for a time, refrained from immediate action, but he prepared to chastise Judah as a master punishing a disobedient vassal. The surrounding nations that had urged Judah's revolt were the first to submit, leaving Judah isolated and entirely dependent upon the reluctant aid of Egypt, which lacked the courage to confront Babylon effectively. Consequently, Nebuchadnezzar's army easily overran Judah, seizing its fortresses. In the southwestern region, the fortified towns of Lachish and Azekah offered resistance, yet the Chaldean forces bypassed them and advanced upon Jerusalem. On the 10th day of the 10th month, at the end of the year 588 before the Common Era, or the beginning of 587 before the Common Era, the siege of the capital commenced in earnest. Jerusalem had been fortified, stocked with provisions, and supplied with water in preparation for a protracted assault. But the influx of refugees from the surrounding countryside, bringing their children and livestock, strained the city's resources. King Zedekiah, along with his palace officers, courtiers, and nobles, refused to surrender, compelling Nebuchadnezzar to enforce a full siege. The defenders of Jerusalem displayed considerable bravery, resisting the Chaldean forces with determination. The siege endured, with intermittent skirmishes and engagements, for nearly a year and a half, from January of 587 before the Common Era until June of 586 before the Common Era. A eunuch in the service of King Zedekiah assumed command of the city's defenses, while the king himself remained passive, neither directing the troops nor leading the resistance. His indecision and weakness were evident in a time demanding courage and leadership. The siege made the prophetic duties of Jeremiah all the more painful. Although his advanced age prevented him from joining in the defense, his patriotism compelled him to encourage the soldiers, and his prophetic insight forced him to proclaim that their struggle was futile. The destruction of Jerusalem was decreed because of the bloodshed and sins committed by its people. Jeremiah's reputation as a true prophet, confirmed by preceding events, allowed him freedom to speak openly, despite the Chaldean armies encamped at the gates ready to carry out a vast punishment. After nearly a year of siege, a sudden development shifted the course of events. Pharaoh Prize, also called Hafra of Egypt, who had repeatedly promised aid to Judah, finally sent a substantial army to confront Nebuchadnezzar. The Chaldeans, upon hearing of this approaching Egyptian force, lifted the siege of Jerusalem and moved to meet it in the field around February or March of 586 before the Common Era. The people of Jerusalem rejoiced as the gates, long closed and barricaded, were opened, and the citizens emerged to savor a brief respite of freedom. Yet this reprieve proved fleeting. The nobility and the affluent, freed from the immediate pressures of siege, returned to their former corruption. Recently liberated slaves were forced back into servitude, violating solemn oaths and covenants. Jeremiah, witnessing this cruelty and injustice, was filled with righteous indignation. He addressed the king and nobles with piercing reproach, condemning their perjury and selfishness, and he foretold the inevitable return of the Chaldean army, bringing with it fire, warfare, famine, and pestilence to punish the city once more. The princes of Judah, long angered by Jeremiah's fearless opposition to idolatry and corruption, now harbored a deadly hatred for him. One day, as the prophet was leaving the city of Jerusalem to journey to his birthplace, Anathoth, he was seized by a sentinel. The guard accused him of intending to desert to the Chaldeans, the powerful people of Babylonia who threatened the land. Jeremiah protested his innocence, insisting he had no thought of flight, yet he was handed over to the princes of Judah. Seizing this opportunity for revenge, they treated him as a traitor and a spy. They beat him severely and threw him into a cistern in the month of Adar, in the year 586 before the Common Era. This cistern was located in the house of Jonathan, the keeper of the lists, known in Hebrew as Sofer, a hard and heartless man appointed as Jeremiah's jailer. In this narrow, unsanitary, and dark place, Jeremiah remained for many days, imprisoned by the very leaders he had sought to warn. Yet the brief exultation of the princes did not last. The Chaldean army, which had marched against the Egyptian forces under King Prize of Egypt, utterly defeated the Egyptian army, routing them completely. The power of Egypt was broken, leaving Judah once again to face the might of the Chaldeans alone. The Babylonians returned to the siege of Jerusalem, surrounding the city more tightly than before to bring it to a swift surrender. Inside the walls, courage faltered. Many citizens, fearing for their lives, abandoned the city at unguarded points, fleeing to the Chaldeans or to Egypt. King Zedekiah, the last sovereign of Judah, recognized too late the folly of attempting to oppose the overwhelming Babylonian power without the support of a liberty-loving and unified people. Famine and pestilence ravaged the city, increasing the toll of death already inflicted by the ongoing war. The number of defenders dwindled until there were too few to man the walls effectively. At last, the final hour of Jerusalem struck. On the 9th day of the month of Tammuz, in June of the year 586 before the Common Era, the city had no bread remaining. The exhausted garrison could no longer resist, and the Chaldeans succeeded in creating a wide breach in the walls, pouring into the city. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was not present, stationed instead at Riblah in Syria. His generals, accompanied by the elders of the Magi, entered Jerusalem unopposed to administer judgment. The Chaldean warriors encountered little resistance as the starved and weakened inhabitants could barely stand. They overran every part of the city, killing able-bodied men and youths, taking many others prisoner and shackling them. The soldiers, hardened and brutalized by the long siege, violated women and maidens without mercy. They entered the temple itself, slaughtering Arnides the priest descended from Aaron, the first high priest of Israel and prophets who had sought sanctuary, as if to defy God himself. The Chaldeans were accompanied by troops from neighboring nations, including the Philistines, Idumeans, and Moabites, all allied to Nebuchadnezzar. They stole the treasures of the temple and desecrated its sacred spaces. Amidst the chaos, King Zedekiah and the remnant of his defenders attempted a desperate escape by night through the royal gardens, using a subterranean passage in the northeastern part of the city. They sought to reach the Jordan River, but Babylonian horsemen pursued them and blocked the narrow passes. Weakened by hunger and exhaustion, Zedekiah and his followers could not evade capture. Within the city, the Chaldean forces seized the remaining dignitaries, including the high priest, Sariah, the captain of the temple, Zephaniah, the palace eunuch who had conducted the war, the keeper of the lists, Sofer, confidants of the king, doorkeepers, and about 60 others. All were taken to Riblah and executed by order of Nebuchadnezzar. The stench of the unburied dead made it impossible for anyone to remain in Jerusalem or its surroundings. Among the prisoners was the prophet Jeremiah, found in the courtyard of the king's palace, and taken by the Chaldean soldiers who assumed he was a servant of the royal household. His disciple, Baruch, shared his fate. Nebuchadnezzar's generals appointed Gedaliah, a Judean of noble birth and son of Acham of the family of Shaphan, as overseer of the prisoners and remaining fugitives. The last hope of the beleaguered nation vanished when news reached them that King Zedekiah had been captured. Near the city of Jericho, he and his followers were overtaken by Chaldean horsemen. The king's warriors scattered, fleeing across the Jordan or into hiding, but Zedekiah, his sons, and several nobles were captured. Led to Riblah, they faced the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar. In retribution for Zedekiah's faithlessness and breach of oath, the king witnessed the execution of all his sons and close relatives before his eyes. Then Nebuchadnezzar had Zedekiah blinded and placed in chains, sending him to Babylon, where he did not long survive the torment. The fate of Jerusalem itself hung in the balance. Though the city had been reduced to a charnel house, its walls still stood. Nebuchadnezzar initially hesitated, but he ultimately ordered Nebuzaradan, the chief of his guard, to destroy it completely. The Idumean nobles, fueled by hatred, demanded merciless action. On the 10th day of the month of Ab, in August of the year 586 before the Common Era, Nebuzaradan executed the command. The walls were razed, the temple and the royal palace set ablaze, and every beautiful house reduced to ashes. The remaining treasures of the temple, including the artistically wrought bronze pillars, the molten sea, the brazen lavers, gold and silver bowls, and the musical instruments, were either smashed to pieces or carried off to Babylon, leaving Jerusalem a desolate ruin. Jerusalem had become a heap of ruins, her streets deserted, her buildings toppled, and the sacred Temple Mount turned into a wilderness. Yet, of all the great capitals that have fallen from heights of glory into dust and ashes, none has been so revered in its destruction as Jerusalem. Its tragic fate was preserved in the art of poetry, in lamentations, psalms, and prayers, expressed in tones so sorrowful and compelling that even in distant ages every tender heart feels compassion for the city. Through these works, poetry wove a martyr's crown around Jerusalem, a crown that, through remembrance and reverence, became transformed into a halo of sanctity and veneration. The prophet Jeremiah, known as Jeremiah, and probably two or three other inspired poets composed four distinct lamentations, each corresponding to one of the four stages of the calamities that befell the city. The first lamentation was written immediately following the capture of Jerusalem. At this stage, the city itself still stood. The walls, houses, and temple had not yet been destroyed, but the city had been emptied of its people and deprived of its former joy and prosperity. This first lamentation dwells on the friendlessness of Jerusalem. Its deepest sorrow lies in the betrayal of her allies, who, instead of offering aid, now delight in her downfall and abandonment. The second lamentation warns the destruction of the city and its defensive walls, and it speaks most keenly of the fall of the sanctuary, the holy temple of the Lord, which had stood as the visible center of the covenant and worship of God. The third lamentation turns to the lingering famine that followed the siege, the starvation that consumed the people, and the despair that fell upon the survivors, particularly after the capture of the king, when leadership and hope were extinguished. Finally, the fourth lamentation portrays the utter desolation of Jerusalem after her complete destruction by the enemy. Every house had been laid waste, every street was empty, and the glory of the city had vanished, leaving nothing but ruins and sorrow. Through these lamentations, the fall of Jerusalem was preserved not merely as a historical event, but as a profound moral and spiritual testimony, a warning, and a memorial of human suffering and divine judgment, immortalized in the voices of those who wept for her and recorded her fate for all generations. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, therefore dispatched some of his generals with a formidable army to lay siege to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. King Jehoiachin, who had sat on the throne of David for scarcely 100 days, had no time to contemplate repentance or prepare his people, for the Babylonian besiegers pressed relentlessly upon the city. The distress among the inhabitants grew unbearable, and recognizing the futility of resistance, Jehoiachin began to negotiate terms of surrender with the generals. When Nebuchadnezzar himself arrived at the encampment, he was entreated by the king, the queen mother, and her court to show mercy. The Babylonian conqueror, however, displayed neither leniency nor pity. He imposed severe conditions. Jehoiachin was to relinquish his throne and go into exile, accompanied by his mother, his wives, his kin, and the eunuchs who served in the palace. Remarkably, Nebuchadnezzar spared the life of the young king, refraining entirely from bloodshed. Yet the consequences for the people were severe. 10,000 warriors and inhabitants of Jerusalem, drawn indiscriminately from the various families of the capital, were uprooted and transported to Babylonia. Among these captives were 1,000 skilled mechanics, artisans trained in forging weapons and building fortifications, whose talents were valuable to the Babylonian war effort. Additionally, 3,023 Judeans from the surrounding countryside were taken as prisoners to Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar also seized the treasures of the palace and the temple, a measure justified by the military laws of the era, yet he left the city itself intact, sparing its walls and leaving the temple uninjured. For a conqueror, the moderation shown by Nebuchadnezzar was extraordinary. Jerusalem, a city with over 500 years of history, had never before witnessed such measured treatment. The Babylonian king likewise refrained from abolishing the throne of David. Instead, he placed on it the youngest son of King Josiah, Mattaniah, who assumed the royal name Zedekiah. Zedekiah was of a gentle, warlike, and pliable disposition. Nebuchadnezzar believed that these qualities would ensure peace and submission in Judah. To secure the new king's loyalty, the Babylonian ruler concluded a solemn treaty with Zedekiah, binding him with an oath of fealty. The land of Judah held extreme strategic importance to Nebuchadnezzar as a buffer against Egypt, a power he was continually seeking to subdue. To prevent rebellion, he had exiled the noble families and princes of Judah, removing daring and ambitious men who might persuade the king to act against Babylonian interests. His objective was clear: to render Judah a weak, dependent state, deriving its strength from Babylon. Despite the severe blow of losing so many noble families and the finest warriors of the nation, Judah's remnant recovered with astonishing rapidity. The capital and countryside, though filled with sorrow and subjugation, rebuilt themselves and returned to a measure of prosperity. Yet the nobles of Judah were dissatisfied with their modest condition. They sought broader spheres of influence. For the previous century, the capital's nobles had not only governed the people but had also dominated the royal court. The kings themselves were often of little consequence, living lives of leisure in imitation of rulers such as Sardanapalus, the ancient Assyrian monarch, preoccupied with trifles within the harem of the palace. Now, with Zedekiah's unkingly weakness and indolence, these nobles could assert themselves more easily. The king, though personally well disposed, lamented the nation's evils and listened to the prophets, yet he lacked the strength to oppose the nobles and restrain their ambitions. Zedekiah may have intended to remain faithful to his oath to Nebuchadnezzar, but he did not possess the fortitude to enforce his resolution. Secretly, rebellious schemes were formed, which he either did not perceive or, if aware, was powerless to prevent. This combination of the king's weakness and the nobles' recklessness ultimately set Judah on the path to catastrophe. Madness seemed to seize the nobles. Suggestions for rebellion spread across the land. Egypt, ever deceitful and treacherous, tempted the Judeans with promises of alliance which it rarely fulfilled. King Ethbal of Tyre, a powerful Phoenician ruler, urged Judah and neighboring territories to rise against Babylon. Meanwhile, the exiled Judeans, still in communication with their homeland by letters and messengers, clamored for war, holding on to a vague hope that Nebuchadnezzar's army could be defeated and that they might regain freedom. In the 4th year of Zedekiah's reign, corresponding to the year 593 before the Common Era, ambassadors from these various nations arrived in Jerusalem. They came from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon, employing every device of eloquence, flattery, and persuasion to sway the wavering monarch into breaking his oath. Judah, courted by foreign powers and at the center of geopolitical schemes, might have felt a sense of pride in being sought after for alliance. It is unknown what reply Zedekiah sent to these ambassadors. His weakness of character made a decisive answer all but impossible, and to this maelstrom of political pressure, the prophet Jeremiah stepped with courage that few could match. His prophetic insight perceived the inevitability of Nebuchadnezzar's sweeping victories and the subjugation of many nations under Babylonian authority. Jeremiah warned King Zedekiah, the nation, and the priests not to succumb to flattering promises or vain hopes, but to submit to Babylonian rule, lest they be crushed by the overwhelming power of the conqueror. Jeremiah's prophetic mission extended even to the exiles in Babylon. He sent them a message, instructing them with extraordinary clarity: build houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them, take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, and multiply ye there and be not diminished.